Welcome, everybody. Today, you're here for the Rapid Response webinar, a 30-minute briefing on the future of special education funding. I'm Aurora from ELA. We'll be diving into a little bit of our agenda and what we're going to do today, along with some introductions. I'm going to give folks a second to get settled in from the waiting room. And while we're waiting to get started, we'll get started here in about 60 seconds. Go ahead in the chat and to let us know your name, your location, and your organization or the work that you do. Just let's do a quick roll call and see who we have here in the room. Great to see some familiar names and faces from the ELA-verse. Also great to see some new folks joining us as well. So thank you. So for folks who are just joining in, take another few seconds to get settled in, get yourself settled in from the waiting room. And if you're able to, we'll just double check the settings on the chat. We're all able to chat with everybody, but I believe we are. Go ahead and let us know in the chat your name, your location, and what organization you're joining us from. Thanks, Lauren, for kicking us off. Lauren Hugh Williams from Pine, joining from Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn myself. Most people know that who've talked to me. All right. While we get settled in, we've only got 30 minutes. We got a lot to cover, so I'm going to keep it moving. But yeah, please we want this to be a lively and interactive experience, so please keep the chat, keep your introductions coming in. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or use the Q&A function. I'll make sure that we have some time towards the end to try to address as many as we can. So welcome, Rapid Response, a 30-minute briefing on the future of special education funding. Hosted by InnovateEDU. What is InnovateEDU? We are a intentional set of alliances, strategically aligned organizations, foundations, expert partners, customers, united by a commitment to systems change on narrow issues, focused on social capital investments to build trust, deploys social financial capital to build interconnected, resilient, self-sustaining ecosystems. What that means is that InnovateEDU is the larger nonprofit that supports many different projects. One of them is the Educating All Learners Alliance, which many of you may be joining and who are familiar with my work at the Educating All Learners Alliance, as well as other projects in InnovateEDU like Project Unicorn, Safe Alliance, Pathways Alliance. So we're all working together to impact positive change in the education ecosystem. So a little bit about what we're going to do today. We're going to dive into, let me move this so I can see. I'm going to set the stage a little bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the study, what we're doing, what the study is looking for, and why it's important. But the panel, our panel of experts are really going to dive in and brief us with some key questions and key responses. There'll be a section at the end where we'll share actionable steps and things that you can do to take action. And if we have time, we'll have some Q&A from the audience. But if you're using the chat and Q&A function and you're able to, and we're not able to get to your question, we will have a record of your registration and your question. So if you have a question, we don't get to it, put it in the chat. That way we can try to follow up with you afterwards. And just a quick bit of housekeeping. Captions are enabled. You can adjust them based on your preferences. Today's session is being recorded. We'll share it with all registrants. And again, you type the questions in the chat for Q&A. All right, I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panel and our presenters. I'm Aurora Jugger. I'm the project director of the Educating All Learners Alliance, a project of InnovateEDU. I'm based in Brooklyn, and much of my work is dedicated towards supporting students with disabilities and learning differences, their teachers, their families, and the ecosystems that support learner variability. I'll pass it over to Cameron. We've got, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, I'm Cameron Benham. Thanks for having me, Aurora. I help support our policy portfolio across our projects at InnovateEDU. Excited to be here. I'll hand it over to Eric.
Thanks, Cameron and Aurora. Grateful to be here. I'm Eric Tucker, a CEO and president of the study group. I've participated in thousands of IEP meetings, first as a student and then as a teacher and special education coordinator, principal, and superintendent. and now as a parent, and bring a kind of lens around policy and finance, as well as kind of practically what young people need to this conversation. I'll pass things over to Ed.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Ed Dieterle, and I'm the founder of Education Research Partners. I've been in education now for about 30 years, first as a high school chemistry teacher and also as a researcher, an officer at a family foundation, as well as most recently an executive at a testing company. I'm obsessed with the good and the bad associated with measurement and to really just make sure that all aspects of a particular study are thought through so that when we land on a particular recommendation, we understand it from a perspective of understanding it fully so that we are making wise decisions and not forgetting how a decision might impact either negatively or unintendedly the student population we wish to protect.
Thank you. Thank you both for that very much. And much appreciation to Cameron and our event support staff at InnovateEDU for helping help this event go off smoothly. So let's dive on in and set the stage. The Institute of Education Services, or IES, they're launching a national study of special education spending. This is the first look at the cost of supporting students with disabilities in over 2 decades. So when this notification, this alert came across our dashboard at InnovateEDU, we knew that the stakes were high, and we wanted to make sure that we helped prepare and explain and sort of set the stage for as many people in our audience as possible. So we're here today to sort of give you a little bit of background on the study, hear from experts, and help you figure out what to do next if you want to submit a public comment. So the U.S. Department of Education officially opened public comment until through March 30th, so through next week. So they're looking for, there's a public comment period open to address the study's design and the data collection instruments. So this is our chance as a community. We really want to make sure that the study is asking the right questions. Ed and Eric, you summed it up really well. And Eric, Ed, thank you for highlighting the importance of asking the right questions to get the good, the bad, and the ugly of all the data that's out there, right? So we want to make sure that this study is reflecting the authentic experience of educators, school leaders, and families. So with that, I'm going to dive into our first question. So for our panel, for Ed and Eric, and I will read this out. What is at stake in this study? I've alluded to it a little bit, but I want to hear from you. Dive a little deeper. What's at stake, and why does it matter for the future of public education? And I'll kick it over. I'm going to kick it over to Eric first, just because you're first in my screen. Go ahead.
So I want to start by thanking Matt Soldner and the team at the Institute for Educational Science for opening this RFI and for pursuing this, and for InnovateEDU and the Educating All Learners Alliance for creating a really great response that I encourage every organization and person here to sign on to. And everyone here to kind of go out and think about who else might sign on to it, and whether submitting an additional supplemental individual submission makes sense. And I say that because a lot's at stake. The federal government has never met the promise to cover 40% of special education costs. And for decades, policymakers have used the lack of data as an excuse to justify underfunding. This study may finally hand Congress the reality-based invoice for what our children deserve. But if we do it wrong, if this study validates what school systems feel like they can afford right now, instead of what students actually have a right to and need, then we break the promise and strip away the power for parents to make the case for what their young person, what their loved one, what their child needs. History also proves that flawed baselines lock vulnerable populations into disparities that don't work, whether in Medicaid or with SNAP. If you get this kind of study wrong, there's a long tail of policy conflict. So it's important that the national study of special education spending not become the next broken algorithm that fails our kids. Fully funding special education is one of the smartest economic decisions we can make. There's great kind of data that every dollar we invest returns between $3 of economic growth and workforce readiness and reduce societal costs. And for younger students, it can be as high as a 1 to 11 return. And investing in special education is good fiscal foresight. We cannot let a baseline of kind of poor data and poor understanding of the status quo impact how our country invests in special education adversely going forward. Ed?
Yeah, so I have two things to add to build on Eric's comments. The first is that like this isn't a handful of students. It's more like 7 million students being directly affected. And that's about 15% of the overall population currently in public schools. And that's a larger number than the entire K-12 enrollment in most states. So I think, one thing to appreciate is just the magnitude. This isn't something small, it's something big. And then the second thing are all the negative consequences of working with or using bad data. So the data is like 25 years old. Remember, this like predates No Child Left Behind, the iPhone, and so forth. And the first thing is if you have bad data, you might misallocate resources. So the idea is that you might over or more likely underinvest in special populations. The second thing is that I'm a researcher and I rely on these kinds of data sets to generate new knowledge or validate existing knowledge. Bad data leads to bad interventions and it leads to bad policy decisions. Next, it also can reduce trust and engagement. So, for example, if the data that you're contributing to goes into a system that is wildly inaccurate, what's going to motivate you to do your best to put good data in or to trust the data that are coming out? And then lastly, it's important to realize that the efforts at the federal level, they are going to inform what happens at the state and the district level. So if we get it wrong at the federal level, we shouldn't expect to magically get it correct at the state and district levels.
Thank you both so much for that. Really sort of adding some nuance to the kind of framing what's at stake here. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this idea of modernization. Ed, you mentioned, I'm going to kick it to you first for this question. You mentioned this is the first time in 25 years that we're even looking at this at a study of this type. So why is this necessary for modernization?
Mhm. Well, you can't modernize what you can't measure. I mean, that's the very first thing. Like, the world has changed over the past 25 years in terms of our ability not only to collect data at lower costs, but to analyze it and to turn that analysis around in a shorter amount of time. All of these things have changed. And then just to double down on something that I shared in my opening remarks, states and local modernization depend on it. Again, if we don't get the federal part correct, we can't expect the downstream implications to be positive. In fact, we only imagine more noise, more bias, more bad outcomes happening if we start with bad data and a lack of modernization. Eric.
So one thing I would add is it's a challenging context to modernize because school systems are facing a fiscal cliff, decreasing enrollment, obligations at state levels around education savings accounts and tax credits. And so there'll be a new version, given AI, given the constraints the systems face. And it's a question of whether it's a student first, quality focused effort at modernization, or one that's kind of driven by macro trends in ways that don't place families and learners and educators at the center. So after a 25-year data void, we can't navigate the complex growing needs of 2026 or of building towards 2030 using a map that's drawn in the flip phone era. We need this study to model the future rather than just look in the rearview mirror. And there's some specific aspect of this, which we can dig in more fully with the next question. We need granular metrics. We need to measure frequency and intensity and sufficiency of kind of provision of services. We need to control for local contexts and kind of local labor markets and local cost structures. And we need to kind of appropriately understand what's happening today in order to chart a clear path towards what the pathway forward is.
Aurora, one more thing to add is that, the outcome of this study is, of course, it's going to find its way to like an academic journal, but the real utility of this work is that it has the ability to inform the congressional mandate associated with the IDEA. And if this study doesn't happen and isn't completed in a robust way, then Congress may not have the full picture in order to act. And so this is really the work that's intended to inform our elected representatives that will have an outsized impact on a generation of people with special needs. It's not the kind of study that's completed and then presented at a conference or published in a fancy journal.
I really appreciate that perspective that, almost all the folks who are part of the InnovateEDU audience or the ELA universe, the ELAverse, we're all committed to and focused on improving outcomes for all learners, especially learners with disabilities. But so a lot of us are like in that work, very much that's our day to day. We're thinking about these things. I love that framing of remembering that the folks who are making, folks who are out there putting things into law and mandates, they might not have the same perspective as we do. So that's really why it's important here to lend our voice. Ed or Eric, I'm gonna let you two jump in because I really do want to hear from both of you, and thank you so much already for what you've contributed. So let's dig in, as Eric kind of alluded to. Let's really dig into how can we ensure that this study measures what students actually need, rather than just what districts are currently able to spend. We've discussed that we don't want this to be a snapshot that then becomes the mandate, right? So what are some specific things that we should be thinking about or looking for that are going to really ensure that the study measures what our kids need?
Yeah. So I'd like to introduce three things. First, we need to be able to get analytic traction on what I might call a kind of sufficiency and appropriateness of services gap. So here, think of a child's IEP as a precise and a sufficient and appropriate medical prescription for them to thrive. And then imagine taking this prescription to the pharmacy, but on a tight budget. So you only have the ability to purchase a fraction of the treatment, say 30%. If a researcher later only reviews your receipts, they might conclude that 30% of the dose was sufficient. And in that case, they'd be measuring your wallet, not what works or what was an appropriate intervention. So it's important that we get measures of not just district spending today, which may be on a starvation budget, but kind of service provision in relationship to IEP mandates. Second is frequency, intensity, and fidelity. And this is one of the ways to get there. That take a student, let's call him Max, where the IEP mandates 2 hours of one-on-one speech therapy weekly or occupational therapy weekly. And due to staff shortages, he gets just 15 minutes in a group therapy and gets it not weekly, but monthly. The basic survey checks, yes, for services, and kind of spells out which services are provided. But there's a huge kind of invisible, unfunded gap that become statistically invisible if we don't capture frequency, intensity, fidelity of implementation of IEP mandates. And the third is respondent identification, that it's critical that we talk directly to kind of system special education directors who have a particular lens on how purse strings are used and matched against needs, as well as kind of school level insights, in some cases, special program level insights, because these are complex budgets. Ed?
So, two things to add to that, and then I think it's important that all on this webinar and a part of the conversation just ask questions. My family and I, we have two kids in public schools. Now, I feel more informed when I walk into that building and engage with the principal or attend a PTA meeting to just ask questions, not necessarily expecting the volunteers or the people who are the frontline workers to have the full answers, but to be able to open up the conversation. The two things that I would add to Eric's, excellent analysis is first this notion of category disaggregation. When we think about putting together a group of 15 million students, like we have the opportunity to think of more than just a handful of categories. So the ability to kind of dive deeper and go more granular, as Eric said, is super important. Otherwise, averages may mask the needs of specific groups. And then, the second is the idea of regional cost variation. If we think of the United States, and if we look at the unit of analysis of a state, then we may forget that the cost of something happening in Aurora's neighborhood in New York City might be a little different than, another part of the country. So really taking into account the fact that the cost of delivering the services can be related to the region and isn't an absolute value.
Thank you both so much for that. And folks, please, if there's any questions if you have any questions out there and you're watching this live and you're in the room, send them our way. But thank you both. And I'm going to come back to Eric and Ed kind of for your final thoughts at the end. But I want to pass it over to my colleague, Cameron. What can people do that are listening and are, okay, you convinced us, this is really important, and I want to lend my voice. What can they do?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting us. Again, thank you to Ed and Eric and your just like expertise and advocacy in this space, and of course, Ela as well. Well, first off, let's just talk about what an RFC is. It's a formal process by which federal agencies, sometimes it's working groups, sometimes it's like congressional committees, where they solicit public feedback from anyone in the community, anyone across the country, usually advocacy organizations and nonprofits, tech companies, whoever can submit comment. These comments are also publicly available and viewable. And so I checked this morning, there are only six comments. And so again, I'm going to get to this, but those reinforcing the need that we need to start submitting comments and circling the wagons and generating support. And last thing I wanted to mention is that you can join onto other organizations' comments. We're going to offer you the opportunity to join into ELA's, or you can submit your own. You can join into others. I think one of the main things that we have found has been successful is either joining onto others to show solidarity with other organizations and amplifying support, or submitting similar comments under your own name. You can elevate very similar recommendations or proposals. But I think given that there's only six comments so far, I think we need to, gin up those numbers a little bit and get some more comments in to reinforce how important this is. Um, and so this is a Paperwork Reduction Act comment, which is typical from the federal government when they launch new initiatives. It's basically a way of understanding what is important to collect, how burdensome it's going to be to even collect this information, and if it's necessary to collect it for federal agency operations, in this case, the Department of Ed. So these are the 5 questions that are on the request. Again, you don't need to answer all of these questions. We'll leave the link to comment in the next few slides. And so again, it's important to keep in mind you don't need to answer every question. You can raise some of the points, which I'll get to in a second, that Eric and Ed raised in the previous panel. And then these are the questions. Is the data collection necessary? Will this information be processed and used in a timely manner? Is the estimate of burden accurate that they provide in the RFC? How might Ed enhance the utility, quality, and clarity of the collected information? And how might Ed minimize the burden of this collection on respondents? And then comments are due, as Aurora mentioned, next Monday. And then I think I have one more slide, Aurora. I just wanted to talk about, in addition to what Ed and Eric amplified in their panel, this is again the opportunity to bring the invisible conditions, the resources or lack thereof of students with disabilities, students across the country to the forefront. Bring their conditions, their information, and their data to the forefront for policymakers to understand why we need to further support IDEA, and then where gaps are um, in spending and efficiency, as Eric had mentioned earlier. So again, these are some of the points: 20-year information gap on how money is even being spent and the effectiveness of how this money is being spent, highlighting why this information is useful for highlighting best practices across our country, but also how we can protect civil rights, and a great advocacy tool as well. And then lastly, reducing collection burdens using modern technologies, artificial intelligence, and others to streamline collection processes using standards that are interoperable, meaning that they're safe and secure and can be used across data silos. And then how you can support under-resourced or overcapacity school districts as well. And then before I turn over to Aurora, if you want to see, we have some example comments on our website. If you want to take a look at those for inspiration, you are happy to do so. And then I'll hand it back over to Aurora.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cam, for dropping that in the chat. Um, and I do want to make sure that on my next slide, I'm going to dive into what ELA is submitting. I do want to make sure that if we don't have it already pulled up and ready to go, that we find that link to the Federal Register. Thank you, Cam. So Cam's going to make sure that we get that link in the chat. Fantastic. So as we mentioned, it's it's important to circle the wagons. I love that phrasing, that idea. So ELA, the Educating Learners Alliance, we are submitting a comment, and we invite you to join on as signatories. So a couple of our key recommendations, longitudinal modeling is needed to is needed so that we can really account for growth in student population and the rising costs of specialized personnel. Making sure that the study incorporates that over the next, in the next few decades, in the next few years, the population of students in special education programs is going to continue to grow, and so is the cost. So that's an important point that we highlight in our comment. Data needs to be disaggregated, broken down by specific disability categories. That way, we're really getting a in-depth picture and view of what our students need, and not sort of a generalized impression of what students with disabilities as a monolithic identity may need. And we want data that actually reflects the actual costs of support, not just current spending. I think we all hit on that point. It's a really important point that we really want to make sure we're amplifying and elevating. The big idea, the big takeaway for me today that I hope you're walking out of here with is better data leads to better advocacy. And Michelle and Cameron are dropping some great links in the chat. And I have here, you can read the full comment. You can read ELA's, what we're planning to submit. And where there's a link there too, where you can sign on. It's a Google form. So if you read the ELA comment, you want to add your voice, sign on, there's a link there too. Just ask that if you do want to sign on to our comment, fill out that form by the end of the day on Friday so we can start to prepare. And yeah, so as we go into the last 2 minutes, we've got, I'm going to ask Ed and Eric sort of for your big takeaways. What do you want folks to walk out of here thinking about? Final thoughts as we go into the last minute here. And I'm going to address some of the things in the chat as well. But Ed, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, I'm going to double down on the data piece and to just say that with better data, we can do things better, right? We can be more efficient. We can make wiser choices. But there's also the flip side. If we have better data, then we can do better things. We can better meet every child where they are and provide them exactly what they need, and to make sure that what they need includes not only the relational dimensions of teaching and learning, but also the resources and the supports that are required. And in the absence of better data, we're flying blind.
I would add that we have just days until the March 30th deadline to influence the next several decades of special education funding. And I encourage you to take 5 minutes today and click the chat link and sign the InnovateEDU coalition letter. By certainly, do it today, but certainly by the 27th. And to use the talking points and materials that you received today as your guide for drafting your own. So put your voice on the record and your organization's voice on the record. Demand that our government measure our children's needs, not just how broken budgeting and provision of services can be, and take advantage of this window of opportunity to shift the next several generations of special education funding. Kind of infrastructure and algorithms for our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's it for our time today. I've got one more comment I'm just going to throw out there. Mia, yes, leave your name in the org field. If you're not able to sign on behalf of your organization and you're looking at our form, you can absolutely put your name, just as long as that's what you're comfortable with, right? Whatever you put in that field is what we're going to use. I'm going to make sure that all of these links get out to everybody who registered at all of the partners in our network today, so you have time to look over everything. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you so much, Ed and Cameron, for joining us today and helping bring us together. Thank you to the InnovateEDU event team for making this possible. And thank you to everybody who joined. I hope to see you out there in the Elaverse and keeping things moving forward in the field of education. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.